Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on a weekday and also when RCB is playing. I'm going to read a bit about the book from the first chapter, which introduces you to the main characters. Okay, chapter 1 is called The Killing Fields. Death solves all problems. No man, no problem. Joseph Stalin. Moscow, Stalin's Great Purge, 2nd September 1937. As night fell, a small, thin man with piercing eyes and a fierce mustache stood at the edge of a pit, facing a firing squad. At 57, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, Chatto as he was popularly known, had run out of luck at last. Revolutionary, anarchist, spy, brother of Sarojini Naidu, friend of Nehru. Once described aptly and memorably by his lover Agnes Smedley as a revolutionary in a dozen different ways, a man of truly fine frenzy, nervous as a cat, always moving, never at rest. The labels no longer mattered. What mattered was that he had been forced, finally, to come to rest, singled out for execution by a power-hungry dictator. As Chatto waited for his lonely death, what was he thinking about? Perhaps of his tumultuous life, which had led him to this point, through England, France, Germany, Sweden, and finally the Soviet Union, trying constantly to muster support for Indian independence. Perhaps of his homeland, which he had not seen for 30 years. Perhaps of his happy childhood years with his siblings and his progressive parents, debating with them over dinner in the large Chattopadhyaya house in Hyderabad. Perhaps of the many women he had left behind in various countries, British, American, and Russian. Perhaps of how he had evaded even the British Secret Service, but eventually ended up a victim of Stalin's paranoia, one of the estimated 700,000 people massacred in the Gulag system of labor camps by the Man of Steel. Or perhaps he thought enviously of his fellow revolutionary, the dashing and charismatic M.N. Roy. 7 years younger, Roy had done what Chatto had wanted to do but couldn't. Won Lenin's friendship, founded one of the branches of the Communist Party of India, climbed to the top ranks of international communism, then cannily fled the Soviet Union in 1930, escaping Stalin's purge. Chatto and Roy had been long-time bitter rivals, though they did not meet till 1920. But the world of the Indian revolutionary at the time was small and interconnected, and they had likely heard and speculated about each other, despite being separated by vast distances. Chatto had spent most of his revolutionary career in Europe, while Roy had traveled through the Far East, the US, and Mexico, before calculating that the Soviet Union and Lenin's mentorship were India's best bet for freedom. With the passage of time, we can see how similar Chatto and Roy were. Despite their diverse backgrounds, the two would lead parallel lives. But like parallel lines, they would never meet in agreement. Thank you. That introduces the two characters.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the book starts off so powerfully and really pulls you in. So I thought I'd begin this conversation by just asking you why you chose to focus on, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya and M.N. Roy out of all the revolutionaries, and there's so many, some of whom also make an appearance in your book, Lala Hardayal or Ashbihari Bose. So why these two figures?
Okay. So after my last book, Lady Doctors, which some of you may have read, that was about India's first women doctors from the 1830s to from the 1860s to the 1930s. I got a lot of offers to write more about first Indian women, first Indian engineers, first Indian legislators, first Indian this and that. And I just didn't want to be in that box where I'm a woman writing only about other women. And I wanted to write a really exciting book, non-fiction that reads like fiction, And obviously, all historical characters do not lend themselves to this treatment. But when I was researching these two characters, I realized that they led such incredibly thrilling lives. I mean, if you read about their lives, it's almost like reading about, The Day of the Jackal by Frederick Fawcett or the TV show that you have seen, because their lives were exactly like that. They were pursued across Europe and the US and, Russia by the British Secret Service and by the intelligence of various countries. They escaped in the nick of time. Chatto, as you know, was executed by Stalin in Stalin's Great Purge, which is what I read, in 1937. His fate was not known until years later. Roy managed to escape Stalin, but also had lots of precarious escapes from near death. Roy was involved in an attempt to smuggle the Russian crown jewels. Chatto was immortalized in a Somerset Maugham story as Chandra Lal. He was like this dashing revolutionary who lived in Berlin. So they just had incredibly thrilling and exciting lives. And I just wanted to write a really exciting book, which is why I chose them.
So did you choose from amongst a few other revolutionaries and then you kind of zeroed in on them? Or?
I was reading about that period, and as you said, there are so many revolutionaries all interacting with each other, interconnected in a way and knowing about each other. But Chatto and Roy had by far the most exciting lives, which is not to say that some of the others, don't deserve books written about them. But I just felt like Chatto especially had been completely forgotten. Roy, I think Roy, many of us have heard of him because, he founded, Indian communism and had a career in India. But Chatto had been completely erased from memory because Stalin's own misdeeds were not visible even to his own people. And it was only in 1991, when the KGB archives were thrown open, that Chatto's fate was discovered. Until then, people just assumed that he had disappeared. And I just felt that the two of them, if you look at the book, it's structured in a way that there's chapter 1 is Chatto, chapter 2 is Roy, chapter 1 is Chatto, chapter 3 is Chatto, chapter 4 is Roy. So you kind of get to see them operating on opposite sides of the world, but there is a thread that sort of connects them, and then they eventually meet in 1920, right? And then they are fierce rivals. Yeah.
And then if you could talk a little bit about the formative influence on their early lives,
right?
When they were in India.
Yeah. So Chatto actually had a very, intellectual upbringing. He grew up. For the latecomers here, Chatto was the brother of Sarojini Naidu. But they were quite different in their outlooks, especially later. And later, in fact, Chatto had quite a tense relationship with Sarojini. He called her a puppet of Nehru and Gandhi, because by then he was, a full-fledged communist. And he took to anarchism very early on. Sarojini followed the Gandhian path. So Chatto grew up in a very large family in Hyderabad in what is now called the Golden Threshold. With 7 sisters and brothers, several of whom were famous. The eldest was Sarojini Naidu. The eldest boy was Chatto. One of them was Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, who became a famous actor and poet. There was another sister called Suhasini who married A.C.N. Nambiar, who was actually rumored to be a spy and, moved in very mysterious circles during the Second World War. So it was a very intellectual family, and Chatto grew up in a very cosmopolitan and secular household. And then he was sent to the UK to study. In contrast, Roy had a completely different upbringing. He grew up in rural West Bengal, near the Midnapur district. And he did not get an education because from the age of about 14, he was a revolutionary, because at the time, Bengal was, this sort of muscular Bengali nationalism. He was influenced by Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandra Pal, that kind of sort of very robust Bengali nationalism, and most often by this man called Bagha Jatin, who was Jatindranath Mukhopadhyay, who was a very famous revolutionary in the day. He killed a tiger, which is why he's called Bagha Jatin. And therefore, Roy started quite early as, he calls himself a terrorist, okay, as a bomb thrower. The chapter on him is called Bomb Thrower because that's what he was doing. From the age of 14, he was throwing bombs at British institutions, at British officials. And, he did that for quite a few years. So, and he was very influenced by the Anushilan Samiti, which was an organization back then, which was devoted to nationalism, revolution, and, also influenced by, Hinduism in a way. So that was his influence back then. So they had very different upbringings, really.
Yeah, so connected to that, I had another question about, you say that M.N. Roy was influenced by, Vivekanand and Bhagat Jatin, who in turn was influenced by the Gita and Hinduism.
Sure.
And then you write, I think that Virendranath Chattopadhyaya was inspired by Veer Savarkar, whom, as we know, articulated the Hindutva and organized and led the Hindutva movement.
Sure.
So I was wondering what you make of these, irreverent, irreligious figure, and I think one of them refers to Hinduism as cow dung religion or something. I think you mentioned that in your book.
Yeah.
The future communists who are influenced by, figures who are influenced by, who are associated with Hinduism or also Hindu nationalism.
Yeah, so the book covers their evolution. Both Chatto and Roy started life very much being influenced by Hindu nationalism, the Bhagavad Gita, and, because at that time, those were the only people who were demanding full independence for India. At the time, Gandhi and Nehru were still, stuck on dominion status for India, right? So these were the only nationalists that they could see. Now, Chatto came to the UK to study law, but he didn't study that for very long because he came into contact with Veer Savarkar and many other revolutionaries at what is called India House, which is in Highgate in North London. And, he was completely influenced by them. In those days, Veer Savarkar, as you mentioned, later he took to Hindutva. At that time, Veer Savarkar was just only about Indian independence and revolution against the British, okay? And he gave a number of very fiery speeches at India House, and there were many others at the time, Madan Lal Dhingra, who ended up assassinating a British official. He was also there, and Chatto was very influenced by all these people. And he slowly came to the realization that India needs complete independence. When he arrived in the UK, he was like, maybe we should ask for dominion status, more power, etc., etc. But by the time he left the UK, he was completely on board with revolution. And Roy also was of the same mind, he was also influenced by the revolutionaries. Now, both these men, later they evolved, and once they came into contact with revolutionaries across the world, Mexicans, Germans, Swedish, they became much less religious. And by the end of their lives, they were both completely irreligious, okay? They did not care. In fact, Chatto used to make a practice of, eating beef in front of, people who used to visit him in Berlin and, horrify them just because he wanted to be provocative. And by the end, they were completely irreligious. So there was an evolution because you remember, this happens over, say, 30 years. So.
Yeah, I mean, in my book also, you see this really with Lajpat Rai as well, who's someone who has a particular kind of view of caste in the beginning of his life, and then he kind of actually becomes more conservative on that question later, or he's, supporting the Khilafat movement at some point and then later regretting it, or saying he won't do a Hindu politics, but then is entering the Hindu Mahasabha. So there's this kind of shift in change across time, which I think you're also talking about that as well, right? When it comes to either Savarkar, but also Chatto and Roy.
Yes, people change over time. So that is what happened to Savarkar as well. And Chatto and Roy went the other way, really.
Yeah. But I wonder also what you make of this kind of them flouting this binary, because we kind of tend to see figures as, left-wing, right-wing, but you have here these, figures who are future communists, but still had this kind of association with.
I think history is very complex and it is not black or white. And people are not black or white. I saw this in my previous book, Lady Doctors. People were extremely shocked because I pointed out that Bal Gangadhar Tilak, while a great man, and a great revolutionary, was against the education of women in science. He believed in a more conservative education for women. And people were shocked by this, but we don't need to be shocked because everybody contains multitudes. And Chatto and Roy started their lives with a particular idea. For instance, Roy was an anarchist, a bomb thrower. But a few years later, by the time he reached the US, and he realized that, just throwing bombs is not going to get India independence. And he decided that he started reading Marxian texts in the US, and of course he met Lala Lajpat Rai there as well. And he came to a completely different, idea of the world. And he decided that, communism is the way to go. Later, he would jettison communism, M.N. Roy, and he would go back to the Congress and say Congress is the only party that can get independence for India, which I don't think he was wrong in that. He said Congress is a mass party. It's the only party that can get independence for India. And then still later, he left the Congress and started his own philosophy of radical humanism. So people keep changing over the years, and nobody is one thing, So, yeah, that's what we need to know.
Yeah, and I think, again, just to bring Lajpat Rai in again, he's also that figure that, is part of the Hindu Mahasabha, but is also actually associated with a lot of labor circles abroad.
Yes.
So labor, very radical kind of circles abroad where you kind of, people always are shocked. To know that this Hindu Mahasabha is kind of associated with, or has friends like Ramsay MacDonald, or a lot of other kind of socialist politicians abroad. Yeah. You write that in your book you've written that Chatto, wasn't driven by ideology, but had this kind of political goal of, Indian freedom, whereas M.N. Roy makes this shift towards ideology. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what causes this shift in Roy, and also more broadly, any similarities. What were the similarities and differences between these two figures?
They sort of kept, switching sides, really. I'm not sure I remember that exact line, but I can tell you that Chatto first started out as, he believed that he was supporting the Congress, and he believed that India could only unite behind the Congress. But by 1930, he was sick of the Congress. He felt that they were a complete bourgeois party. And he was a close friend of Nehru, but by 1930, he had fought with Nehru, called him all kinds of names. Both Chatto and Roy were never one to toe the party line. They said what they thought, which is perhaps why they have been completely forgotten, really. So, and by then he had moved to communism, completely. And as we see, that was not a great decision on his part, because he was eventually executed by Joseph Stalin in Stalin's Great Purge. But, nobody predicted Stalin's Great Purge, not even the Soviets. So, that was just how it was. Roy, meanwhile, started out as a communist. And then when Chatto switched to communism, Roy sort of swooped in and said, no, we now need to support the Congress because we need independence for India, and the Congress is the only party that can deliver it. They're the only party that have mass appeal. So he changed and he became more pragmatic. I think Roy was the more pragmatic of the two, though he was still not pragmatic enough to get along with Gandhi. But he was still the more pragmatic of the two, whereas Chatto managed to sort of, he had picked a fight with Nehru, he picked a fight with Gandhi, he picked a fight with Sarojini. And then, which is why, in a way, when he disappeared from sight in the Soviet Union, nobody really cared that he just disappeared. And, that was the tragic part. So this is how they were a little, different in their ways. Yeah.
And in terms of shifting into ideology, because I think you mentioned that as well, his shift from being a revolutionary nationalist into a more ideological, an ideologically driven person for whom ideology does matter.
Both of them, they believed in violent revolution at a point, and then later realized that this is not going to work against such a huge, powerful empire as the British Empire. We need to develop an ideology and, make the people adopt it, that kind of thing. So, which is why they both decided to go to communism, because I know, communism these days not very popular, as I say in my book, and we have all seen that it doesn't quite work in the way that Lenin envisaged it. But we forget that in the 1920s, just after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin was an icon to India, because, you know, he had defeated both the aristocrats. He had defeated you know, kept out the Western powers. Later, Stalin was also an icon in India because he managed to defeat the Nazis and turn them back, you know, with his Stalin's Red Army. So there was a great deal of affection and admiration for both Lenin and Stalin in India. I mean, as we know from developments in the South. So, in fact, when Chatto was lying, you know, sort of cold and dead in his grave in Moscow, in the Kommunarka, which is the killing fields, Sarojini Naidu was praising Stalin, who was called Uncle Joe, and she was saying, you know, what an icon and revolution, and he has liberated the masses, because people just did not know the extent of Stalin's, you know, misdeeds until much, much later when it was revealed. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could also, I mean, both these figures led very, you know, incredibly interesting lives of travel and, you know, very mobile, itinerant lives,
Sure.
living large parts of their life outside of India, you know,
Sure.
abroad. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, who were they meeting, what their activities were, what were the influences on them,
Sure.
what the milieu was that they were kind of immersed in at this.
Yeah, that was another thing that drew me to these two characters. They were not by no means the only characters who led such incredibly cosmopolitan and mobile lives. Okay, and of course, part of it was that they were forced to do so because the British Secret Service was hot on their trail. So, which is why, you know, Chatto had to flee from the UK to Paris, and then from Paris to Stockholm, and then from Stockholm to Berlin, or the other way around, and then eventually he ended up in the Soviet Union because he literally had no place else to go. So partly it was forced on them, partly it was because they were looking for new ideas. And, you know, like, for instance, Roy went to the Soviet Union to meet Lenin. Roy was called Lenin's young man. So they met some incredible characters in their travels. They met Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong. Roy was sent to China by the Comintern on what was eventually ended up like a fool's errand. You can read more about that in the book. He messed it up a bit. But they sort of, you know, went all over the world. And we always think of Nehru as sort of a true cosmopolitan and internationalist. But I think before Nehru, Chatto and Roy were true cosmopolitans and internationalists, because Chatto spoke about 15 languages, I think. I mean, he spoke practically every European language. He also spoke several Indian languages, maybe about 10 maybe. Roy also spoke several languages. He ended up speaking German so fluently that he could write in it. Roy was a completely self-educated man because he got no education, but he educated himself through libraries and reading. And he has written, I think, more than 30 books, and they are well worth reading if you have time. M.N. Roy's books available all across the internet if you just Google, okay? He wrote a lot. He had an opinion on practically everything. I mean, there's literally not like, you know, a bird alighting on the earth that M.N. Roy had an opinion of it and was dashing off a letter to the Times or something like that. He wrote so much. Chatto, little less, I think. Perhaps he didn't have the opportunity. So they really learned from all these different revolutionaries, different movements across the world. And they tried as best they could to implement these, you know, in their own lives as well. So I feel like I was drawn to them because they were actually the first cosmopolitans and the first internationalists, I think, or at least one of the early ones, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you wanted to talk a little bit more about, you know, Chatto's time in London, Paris, Berlin, anything about that, and also Roy and...
Yeah, Chatto had, maybe let me talk about the most exciting incident in Chatto's which is also, it's a bit silly. That chapter is called A Dagger, a Revolver, and a Bottle of Chloroform. Because what happened was, Chatto was trying to raise money for the Indian independence movement. Both of them were trying to do only that for years, which was very difficult. Nobody wanted to give money. And he was told that, the Germans are going to give him some money. Germany at that time was, fighting the British in the First World War. And he was in Berlin then, I think, and he was told to rush across to Switzerland. And he got a call saying, please come, we're going to give you some money. And his brother, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya, writes about this because it was quite a silly incident, because Chatto rushes there, and then it's actually a trap set by the British Secret Service. And they have a dagger, a revolver, and a bottle of chloroform in the car. And they just grab him, and they start driving with him in the back seat, okay? And eventually he is rescued by the Swiss police, who see something, strange about the car, and they rescue him from that. And Virendranath Chattopadhyaya writes about this, and he says, Chatto is very naive because, nobody rushes to get money when somebody calls you on the phone. But I think by that time, Chatto was just very desperate to get the money, and he was happy to risk his life. And this whole incident is also immortalized in the Somerset Maugham story I talk about, where Chatto appears as the dangerous revolutionary Chandra Lal, and he has a love affair with a sort of Italian Matahari character called Giulia Lazzari. The short story is called Giulia Lazzari. And eventually Chandra Lal consumes poison and dies in a sort of dramatic moment, with a cyanide capsule. So they just had very exciting lives. Another incident is M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy is actually the man who started the Mexican Communist Party. This is very strange to me, because the Mexican Communist Party is actually started by an Indian, M.N. Roy, with 5 other people. So it didn't ever become very big, but nevertheless, it was the first communist party outside the Soviet Union. And M.N. Roy went to Mexico to escape the US police. And there, he met some men and decided to start the Mexican Communist Party. And while he was there, he also met a Russian man called Borodin, who was a friend of Lenin's. And M.N. Roy helped this man smuggle out the Russian crown jewels, okay, from the ones that were recovered from if you know the Russian history, they were recovered from the Romanovs, who were all massacred, the aristocracy. These crown jewels were supposed to fund the revolution. And M.N. Roy was roped into this. And according to him, he did a great job of, smuggling them out, but nothing more is heard of them. So we don't know where they are, or at least I couldn't trace them. So all kinds of exciting things they did, which is, of course, why I wrote the book. So, yeah.
Yeah, and anything else about Roy's time in the US? I know he did meet Lala Lajpat Rai also, but he met a lot of other characters.
Yeah, I think he met Lala Lajpat Rai, and Lala Lajpat Rai was feeling very homesick for India, and he said, make some Rosgullas for me. So M.N. Roy made Rosgullas for Lala Lajpat Rai. Lala Lajpat Rai, sorry. M.N. Roy also had a very exciting time in Moscow, because he was given a lot of responsibilities by the Comintern. He addressed the crowds in Moscow. He didn't speak Russian, so he addressed them in English, but there was a response, good response according to him. He was sent to China to convert the Chinese to communism, but that became a big mess because of Chiang Kai-shek's powerful army. You can read about in the book. He was also sent to Tashkent with a whole wagon full of gold. So, exciting. He got to do lots of exciting things. He was sent to Tashkent, the whole wagon full of gold, and, a bunch of ammunition and, all kinds of guns and stuff like that, to start a revolution there in Central Asia. That also did not work out. There were a lot of harebrained schemes that M.N. Roy and Chatto were sent on. And in fact, last week I was in Delhi, and I was doing a session with Manu Pillai, whom some of you may know, and he said, I think you should name this book Messy Men and Their, and the Women Who Run With Them. And it is true that their lives were very messy. This is another reason why I wanted to write the book, because as I say in the beginning of the book, this is not a book about communism, socialism, capitalism, the various isms. It is not that kind of book. There are many, many scholarly books that you can read on that. I basically wanted to write this book about 2 humans who sum up what it is to be human, which is to try and fail and make terrible mistakes and have messy relationships and then get up and try again and then fail again. So this book really is about the human side of these two people, which I always feel like we forget about in history, because there are literally, like, there's a 4-volume book on M.N. Roy, which goes into minute detail about his philosophy, his communist philosophy and all. But I didn't want it to be that kind of book, really. I wanted it to be a book for everyone, not just communists. So, yeah.
That's interesting, because I tried to do something similar but in a different way, by kind of showing, because my book is an intellectual history, so it was really focusing on nationalism and following Lala Lajpat Rai's nationalist thought as it evolved through time, and it's very messy and zigzaggy.
Yes.
Not linear, as how often either it's kind of portrayed as, this is a coherent philosophy of a person or a coherent ideology, or it's kind of, changed through time, which is linear. But what I wanted to also show was this kind of zigzag. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or you can kind of have progressive ideas on caste, but then actually retreat later.
Sure.
And also then the tensions within people's thought, and sometimes also inconsistencies in their thoughts. So, that kind of side of a human struggle with ideas. And I think you're trying to do something similar, but in a different way, through just their journey and life.
It's very zigzag.
Yeah.
It's very zigzag. So, yeah, that is how they were, really. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted you to talk a little bit about one of my favorite chapters, which is chapter 10 on this very fascinating woman called Agnes Smedley, who came up in my research also, but as a, in like one line, because of Lajpat Rai and how she he provides her with some sense of security and safety at a time when she's, seeking a father figure. And you kind of go a lot deeper into who this woman was and this kind of live wire figure. So I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about Agnes Smedley, and also particularly in relationship to what you refer to as the macho culture of the Indian nationalist movement.
So that's actually my favorite chapter, because it's about a fascinating woman called Agnes Smedley. There are whole books devoted to her. So Agnes Smedley was an American journalist and activist, and she and Chatto had a long relationship. I guess you could call her his common law wife. They never married exactly, in Berlin, where Chatto was at the time. They had a long and very tumultuous and eventually very toxic relationship. So Agnes Smedley was an amazing woman. She came from a completely working class background in Missouri. She was not educated. She was the complete opposite of Chatto, because Chatto was a very sophisticated man, very well read, very highly educated, and so was his entire family. And they meet in Berlin, and sparks fly. They end up moving in together. Agnes Smedley was a complete Indophile. She believed in independence for India, which is unusual because not many people believed in independence for India back then. Even, revolutionaries and socialists believed that India should be a dominion of Britain. So she believed in independence for India because she had met Lala Lajpat Rai in New York and been quite influenced by him. So then she comes to Berlin to escape the police in the US. Meets Chatto, they end up living together, and they have a very tumultuous relationship, mainly because Chatto, while he was a revolutionary on the streets, was not able to be a revolutionary at home. And this, I think, mirrors my last book as well. Like so many Indian men, he was, he believed in certain things, but not at home and with his common law wife. And therefore, he treated her very badly according to her account of things, according to some other observer's account of things. Unfortunately, I could not find any letters by Chatto referring to their love affair, which is a hole in the story. But according to her, he treated her very badly. He made her into sort of a domestic drudge. They were constantly revolutionaries coming in and out of the house. She would have to cook for them, clean for them. He would take all her money. They had very little money. They were living in absolute poverty in Berlin during the war years. So there was absolutely nothing to eat. And eventually, Smedley just gets totally fed up. She writes quite a lot of very disturbing letters and eventually leaves him. She leaves him and she does something exciting. She goes to China And there she becomes very involved with Mao and his long march, and she ends up becoming a foreign correspondent in China and writing about the Chinese Revolution, which was, its very early stages then. Mao had just appeared on the scene. And the last time they meet is in Moscow, quite amicably. And then she says by then Chatto had become old and grey, but he could not return to India. He wanted to, but he could not because the British would arrest him the minute they arrived there. And, they part in very sad terms. So they know they're not going to see each other again. And she suspects that Chatto is possibly, going to die or something. But she does not know. She never knows that he dies by being executed by Stalin. She never finds that out, okay? Because she dies before then as well. So it's a very tragic sort of chapter. And it sort of shows how, you can have all these very sort of high-flown ideals, but you're mostly unable to implement these in your own home, really. So.
Yeah, and I think I liked it also because it actually shows exactly that human side also of the flaws of these characters also. And specifically with, you have anti-colonial revolutionaries who really have this kind of halo around them and, this uncritical eye with which, at least historians are always critical, but in the public often there is this kind of halo of, hero worship and hagiographical kind of attitude.
Yes.
And I like the way you use gender there to kind of show a different side.
Yes. Oh, I forgot to answer your second part of your question, which is the sort of macho nature of the Indian nationalist movement at the time. Oops. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as I was saying, Agnes Smedley was involved in the, in the revolutionary movement with the Berlin Indians. The Berlin Indians were Chatto and several other Indians, and they were rivals to M.N. Roy and his group of Indians. And she knew M.N. Roy as well. She had met him in the US. And what stands out from all the letters and documents is the way Agnes Smedley was treated by these men, because it was a very macho culture. By then, M.N. Roy was married to an American woman called Evelyn Trent, who became Evelyn Roy. But she was a good Indian wife because, she sort of put all her ideas and her her ambitions on the back burner and completely devoted herself to M.N. Roy. Okay. And, she would help him write his article, should be his secretary, should go with him, travel with him from Berlin to Moscow, Moscow to Berlin. Whereas Agnes Smedley had ambitions of her own. She was doing her own writing. She wanted to do her own thing. And because of this, she was treated quite badly, it seems, by everybody in the Indian nationalism because they did not know where to put her. She was not a wife. She was not something else. What was she? She was attached to Chatto, but she was not his legal wife. And it was a very macho culture. In fact, Agnes Smedley claimed that she had been raped by one of the Indian nationalists. She writes about it she wrote a novel. She probably didn't have the courage to write about it in real life. So she wrote a fictionalized version in a novel. And she does not name whom the rapist was. There are all kinds of theories flying about, which you can see in the book. Most likely a man called Hirambalal Gupta, who is forgotten now. So she was also raped by one of these men, and she could do nothing about it because she did not have the status of a wife, and Chatto didn't want to marry her, and for that matter, she didn't want to marry him either, because they both realized that they were not cut out for each other. So she was actually treated very badly by all these people. In fact, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya and his wife, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyaya, visited Berlin, and Kamala Devi was, as you may know, a very sophisticated, highly educated, very beautiful woman. And Agnes Smedley felt very inferior when she met them because she was a working class woman who had just emerged from misery with nothing, no money, no education. And she actually felt that they were condescending to her and not treating her well. Some of it possibly in her own head, but there's also some truth in it as well. So, yeah.
Do you think that's one point of similarity between Chatto and Roy, this kind of...
Both Chatto and Roy did not, I think, treat their wives very well or the women in their lives. So, as I said, Agnes Smedley and Chatto, they broke up. Chatto later got married to a Russian woman called Lydia Karunaskaya when he was in the Soviet Union. And apparently he did treat her well. Perhaps he had changed by then because she writes very fondly of him. So that's good to know. Roy actually treated his first wife, Evelyn Roy, very poorly. She did everything for him. She gave up everything for the Indian cause. And let's remember that what this meant was running from place to place ahead of the British Secret Service. So she had to run with him. You know, she was always just a jump ahead of the British Secret Service, as she writes about. He eventually ended up dumping her in about, I think around 1930. I have to check the date. And he dumped her and he went off with somebody else. There were a lot of revolutionary women surrounding M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy was a extremely charismatic and good-looking man. So there were lots of women around him. And she had to go back to the US. She also writes some very heart-rending letters because she says, I have devoted my entire life to the cause of India, but nobody accepts me and it's been for nothing, really. And then she goes back to the US and he marries another woman called Ellen Gottschalk, who was a German lady. After several love affairs, he marries Ellen Gottschalk. And when he returns to India, M.N. Roy takes Ellen Gottschalk along. She becomes a complete Indian bahu. You know, she wears a sari, she looks after, you know, she basically keeps all his records, and God knows there were many, because every letter that he ever wrote is preserved by Ellen Gottschalk. Okay? And, you know, they end up living in Dehradun, where he starts a new movement called radical humanism. They have lots of people visiting, his disciples, you know, his prodigies. And Ellen Roy is the perfect hostess and looks after everybody and does everything. And very sadly, M.N. Roy dies in 1954 after a fall. And Ellen Roy continues living on in Dehradun. And very sadly, she also died in a very savage manner. She was brutally murdered by two young boys, probably for money. Initially, there were rumors that she was murdered for some other reason, but I think probably for money. And in her last years, she did write, she said, again, like Evelyn before her, she said, I have followed this man throughout the world. And, you know, I could have done something on my own, because she was also very accomplished. And she said, but the fact was that he was so sort of, you know, charismatic and, you know, so, you know, kind of like the sun, that he blotted out everything else. And I could only kind of look at him and not ever think of myself, which is very sad, actually. So I guess, yeah, this is the way men were in those days, and this is the way women had to be, I suppose. But Agnes Smedley, of course, did not, you know, conform to that, and she went on to lead a very checkered life. She's worth looking up, and she was eventually buried in China, in the Revolutionary Cemetery. So there.
Yeah, and just to, you've touched on it a little bit already, but just if one had to ask you, you know, what is the difference then between Roy and Chatto, or the Berlin Indians and the, you know, the communist group?
As I said, Roy was more pragmatic, but even he was not very pragmatic. In fact, the obituary for him, the Guardian obituary, which is in the last chapter, it says something like, I'm paraphrasing, but it says something like, you know, never has there been a man with such an extraordinary kind of, you know, life which led to nothing. Because he was completely unskilled in party maneuver. He just could not get along with Gandhi. He could not get along with Nehru. He could not get along with anybody. So he was just sort of pushed out and forgotten. I think Chatto and Roy, they were similar and, yes, of course, different. I think Roy was more pragmatic and wilier and managed to get Lenin to endorse him, which was what Chatto wanted as well. Chatto wanted Lenin to endorse him, but Roy managed to get that. I think Roy possibly was much more charismatic and much more, you know, able to influence people than Chatto. Roy said that if Agnes Smedley, he called her the wicked temptress, which is, of course, such a, you know, male Indian thing to do. And he called her this wicked temptress who has led Chatto astray. And if she had not been there, Chatto would have had a great career. I'm not so sure about that, but that was Roy's opinion anyway. So maybe he felt that Chatto had been held back by thing. The thing is that there was room for only one person to be endorsed by Lenin, and that was Roy. You know,
but I guess here it's pragmatism maybe, but also ideology. You know, the turn to ideology that you were talking about.
Yeah. So
that Roy seemed...
Roy was able to switch, you know, change ideologies as time went by. He went from communism to Congress, and he went from Congress to radical humanism, depending on what he felt was important. And you can admire that, or you can also say he can't stick to anything. The reason he was expelled from the Communist Party International because he said by the 1930s, he began to realize that only Congress can take India to independence. Gandhi had come on the stage with his huge charisma and appeal to the public, appeal to, the masses. And M.N. Roy decided that the Communist Party in India was tiny and undeveloped and will not be able to take India to independence. If we want independence, we go to Congress and we try to change it within Congress, try to make it more socialist within Congress. Okay, and because of that, the Comintern expelled him. Because he said that, they've considered Nehru as a bourgeois, Gandhi as a bourgeois, everybody was a bourgeois according to them. So, yeah, so that was it.
Just how do their stories end then? I mean, you also
I
touched
talk
on
about
that,
in the last chapter, I think maybe I did not, this was a point I wanted to bring up, but I forgot. When I was writing this book, my mother, who is in the front row here, she said that, why do you want to write about two men who are failures? So I said, so why do you consider them failures? Because I've not heard of them. So the thing is that in history, a lot of people are erased for various reasons. Chatto was erased, one, because we do not know about him, because he was executed by Stalin. Stalin's misdeeds were revealed much later, and his fate only in 1991, when the KGB archives were revealed to the world. So that's one reason he was erased. Second is that both these men fought with Gandhi and Nehru. And that is another reason why they were forgotten, okay? Number three is all their exploits were in foreign countries in the days before, obviously, the internet and, modern communications. So, and a lot of their exploits are in foreign languages, Russian, Dutch, French, Mexican, Spanish, and so that's another reason why they were erased. Regarding on whether they were failures or not, I don't think they were, because they had many successes and indeed influence upon other people of the time. For instance, Chatto was a co-founder of the League Against Imperialism. Nobody knows about it today, but it was basically a United Nations for the colonized. So we already had the League of Nations back then, which was all the big powers. And looking now at the state of the world, you can see how completely powerless the UN is. So Chatto and another man called William Munzenberg had a vision in which they said, we need an organization for the colonized people of the world, India, Africa, all African countries. So it did not work out. It limped along for a few years and did not work out. But later, Nehru borrowed from this idea for his non-aligned movement. And Nehru was a big supporter of Chatto in those early years. It's only later they fell out. In the non-aligned movement, this is exactly what the non-aligned movement in the 50s was. And in fact, many people acknowledged that it had its roots in the League Against Imperialism. I don't know that Nehru ever acknowledged it. I could not find any evidence. Secondly, M.N. Roy was a huge trade unionist. He was always on the side of the peasant and the working man. And he influenced many other trade unionists, including, people like Maniben Kara, V.B. Karnik. These are names that may not be familiar to you, but just to give an idea, they headed, the first trade unions in Bombay for mill workers, for ship workers, for domestic workers, and all those unions. And it is those trade unions which have led to the formation of at least some level of Indian labor laws. Okay, not perfect, but something. Okay, and M.N. Roy was the one who consistently fought for that. Later, of course, he moved to the radical humanism philosophy, which I've dealt with in the book. It's quite an impractical philosophy in many ways, because he said that India needs a renaissance in which we do not care about religion, caste, creed. And, we need to borrow scientific ideas from the West, not this superstition. At the time, Gandhi and M.N. Roy were complete polar opposites, because M.N. Roy was a hedonist, a rationalist, a complete, atheist. And Gandhi was not. Gandhi believed in, religion, tradition, changing India within our culture, whereas M.N. Roy wanted to jettison all that and get rid of all that and start a fresh renaissance. And I think we can agree that that was quite impractical given India, the state that India was at its independence. But nevertheless, I find myself drawn to such an attractive philosophy because Roy predicted, he said that India is going to become a very unequal society, much more unequal than when the British ruled. And I think that has come to pass. We have seen that, the trickle-down theory has not worked. And, there's a 1%, which is all of us, sitting on top of the remaining people, the 99%. So it's clearly not worked. So I find myself drawn to some of his ideas, even as I recognize that not all his ideas would have worked. But I still think they're worth reading and worth understanding and thinking about. So in that way, I think they have a legacy. So,
do you think, the revolutionary terrorism aspect or anarchism aspect is also linked to why their memory has been kind of...
Yes, I do think so, because as, for instance, Sarojini Naidu had a very fraught relationship with Chatto. And in fact, at one point, she disowned him completely. And then her father, Revolutionaries Chattopadhyaya, stepped in and said, don't you dare disown, one of our family. Because by that time, he was a revolutionary and anarchist. And Sarojini was a staunch Gandhian. And I do think that Gandhi and Nehru, for instance, when Madan Lal Dhingra assassinated a British official in London, Gandhi and Nehru washed their hands of him because they were wedded to non-violence by then, and they said that this is not acceptable and this cannot be done. Okay, I understand why, but this is how it was. And I think that's one of the reasons why, Chatto was sort of completely forgotten, because he was just this crazy revolutionary, doing crazy things somewhere in some deep corner of Europe. And in fact, Nehru told Chatto, he said, you have no idea of events on the ground, because Chatto used to lecture Nehru and say, do this, do that. You need to let go of Gandhi. Gandhi is bossing you around. Why do you allow this man to boss you around? But Nehru was a congressman and believed in Congress unity to the very end. I do not think he was wrong exactly. And Chatto thought that, Nehru should kind of distance himself from Gandhi and, strike out on his own. That was what he thought. And I think because of that, he has been forgotten. And, Nehru and Chatto eventually, they just parted ways, and Nehru was completely fed up. And he said, you have no idea of how we do things in India on the ground. You're not on the ground. And we are the ones on the ground. And we know what will appeal to the masses. The masses, he didn't say it in these words, but what he felt was that the masses want Gandhi and Satyagraha. So, yeah.
I think with Chatto, it seems more like the personality factor, whereas, whereas with M.N. Roy, it seems maybe there's like a broader, complex, explanation to do with probably the nomadic nature, but also India's relationship with communism.
True.
Which I guess I find interesting, considering, the right wing today complains that its figures have been neglected, but here you have another side to the story.
Sure.
And especially because people consider Nehru to be, socialist, close to the left.
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether you have any thoughts about that.
I don't know. I mean, I think I spoke about that, like the reasons why they were forgotten. I mean, there was an incident where Gandhi asked Roy, just after he had emerged from prison, to come and pray with him. And of course, Roy could easily have gone and prayed with him. But did Roy do that? Of course he didn't. He said, I don't pray for anybody. So that in itself sort of, immediately Gandhi, and then Gandhi wrote in a postcard to Roy, I think you had just better be a mute observer to the freedom movement, just observe from the sidelines. I don't want you to be involved in any way, because Roy kept saying, can I be involved? Can I be involved? And Gandhi was like, yeah, it's not required. We'll just carry on, the rest of us. So their personality is also very difficult. And their disciples have written, and their proteges have said, if they had compromised on their personalities, they would not have been the men they were. They would just have been, sucking up to these people. And then, of course, other people say, well, why couldn't they compromise a little bit? Because everybody in the years leading up to independence, everybody had to compromise to a certain extent. That was the whole point, to mobilize the nation. So it's difficult to kind of say, but I think I explained why they were forgotten, really. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else that you would want to share about, some
I
interesting
think we
aspects?
didn't get to talk about a thing that I did want to talk about. Sorry if this is going on too long, if anybody can tell me. So there is a debate at the moment amongst historians about why India does not have popular history. So William Dalrymple spoke about this. Popular history in the sense easy, accessible history that everybody can read and understand, like the West has in the form of authors like Tom Holland, Peter Frankopan, Dalrymple himself, and various others. And there are many reasons for this. So I myself am not a historian. My degree is in law. And then I went into journalism, and then I just started writing history. So I'm not a trained historian. I'm trying to find a sweet spot between WhatsApp history and scholarly history. Because my firm belief is that the first thing to do is that the history should be read. Now, if you have a bunch of scholarly books, for instance, there's a 4-volume book on M.N. Roy, which is very good, but I don't think most people will read it. Not in these times where nobody has the time to read. There is a huge scholarly book about Chatto, very good book. It's in my acknowledgements by Professor Nirod Barua, who has done original research. But again, I feel like nobody's read that because it's very scholarly. And I am trying to find that spot, and it's extremely difficult because condensing all that material into an easily readable format and into a sort of a thrilling format, or at least a compelling format, is very difficult. And I know some historians possibly disapprove of this whole process because they think that you're dumbing it down. And then, of course, there are other people who, on the other side, who think that all history should be in the form of YouTube videos because nobody is going to read. So I am hopefully trying to find a spot in the middle. And I think we need more books in the middle, popular history that everybody can read, but not necessarily, for instance, if you read this book, I'm sure people are going to tell me, but in 1932, M.N. Roy said this, and that's not in the book. But it is impossible to have everything that M.N. Roy said in this book. So I have left that out. And there will be a lot of, fervent communists who may think that communist philosophy has not been adequately explained in this book. But again, as I said, that is not my intention. So I do think we need more popular histories, and we are getting some. People like Manu Pillai and Anirudh Kanisetti are writing more popular histories. But possibly we need more. I don't know what you feel about this as a trained historian. So, yeah.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, actually, this only. But yeah, this is something that is also kind of... I don't know if troubled is the right word, but I've also been moved by these very questions of this gap between what scholars produce as history and what the public often consumes as history, WhatsApp history. There was this whole controversy, and I also wrote an op-ed about that. And my book was also an attempt to kind of bridge that gap. So I'm a historian who, has that BA, MA, PhD in history, trained in history and the method of history. And then you have to kind of... The point of that is to kind of produce original research and contribute to a specialized debate. So for me, it was, contributing to the field of Hindu nationalism and be taken seriously. So you have to kind of produce this original research, either look at untapped sources or look at sources which have been looked at but not very well with new fresh questions, and produce that and contribute to that debate and be published in what are called peer-reviewed journals, and be taken seriously by your peers who are other historians who are specialists in your field. So that's this whole process. And often what a young scholar like me would do is to, publish with an academic press. That is also what you should do. But I tried to kind of do both. And then I wrote this book. So I did the whole peer-reviewed, journal articles, but I also wanted to communicate that same history to the public. So it's kind of like trying to do two things, because one is a specialized, it's like a scientist trying to communicate to advanced science, and that has its own specialized language and all of that. And then you also want to communicate that to the public, and that requires simplifying. So it's kind of like going deep and then simplifying. which you can see in the book, because I'm trying to cater to both. That's why it's also fat, because you want to, be taken seriously as a scholar and also do this. But I think, there are. So it's really you doing two different things. There are two different jobs, and I think often there's a miscommunication between academic historians and popular historians or public historians who are really doing two different things. True. And often that's where there's that tension that happens between scholars who will be like, oh, but why is it not nuanced? And, there's this, you have to make it more complex. And it's of course much more complicated than, what you can do in a YouTube or a talk or in a slim book and all of that. And I think there is some sense, sorry, I'm like rambling on a little bit, but it'll be nice to hear your response also. But the other view of historians is that often, I guess, the visibility is with the public historian, and trained historians end up doing hard work, underpaid work, which doesn't get that same visibility. And I think the popular historians have the other grouse of kind of maybe feeling like they're being asked to do something that they're not trying to do, and to kind of also acknowledge that, this is also a service of trying to bring history to the public.
No, I think you're right. I think we are trying to do two different things. For me, it's very simple. I don't stay up at night thinking about it. I have no conflict at all. I just want people to read my book. That is not to say that there are lies in the book, but every chapter I wrote, if you look at the book, I don't know if you notice this, every chapter starts with an exciting anecdote, because that's my journalism background coming into it, that you start with the best anecdote you have so that the reader doesn't get bored and put down your book. And obviously, trained historians are going to be looking at this and shuddering. What is this hideous, way of structuring the book? But I don't really care. I feel like the only thing I want is for people to read my book and know about these people. And then if they want to know more, there are a huge, footnotes where they can explore further. And they can know more, and they can read original letters and the original memoirs and everything. But I felt like my job is to produce a readable, compelling book that you cannot put down. And probably that completely conflicts with, the historian's remit. But I felt like that is what I wanted to do with these two characters. Because as I said, they were so exciting that I couldn't condemn them to a scholarly book. I'm sorry if that sounds like, really awful, but I didn't want them to be sort of buried somewhere, Yeah.
But that is also because these are different functions in a way, right?
True.
The popular or public historian is doing something else. You are kind of communicating the lives and, ideas or lives of people to the public, whereas a historian trained in the methodology of history will be doing something completely different, which may not be visible to the public always.
It won't be. I think maybe it'll be visible to your peers, and you will get sort of, respect amongst your peers. I feel like I'm not sure that there is much of a peer structure in popular history yet in India. Yeah. It's still a very sort of, nascent field. It's a sort of, just starting out. So I don't know that there are peers as such. There is a book that I often talk about. Why not talk about it again? Because it's a great book. In writing this book, I was very much inspired by this book by this woman called Anita Anand. It's called The Patient Assassin. I don't think it became big in India. She's a British Indian. So she lives in the UK. And it's about Udham Singh, who was a man who 30 years after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, I think maybe 25 years, anyway, a long time, he sort of plotted revenge against the man responsible for Jallianwala Bagh, and he went and assassinated him in London. And he took a lot of time to do that. And he was, of course, promptly hanged. So she wrote this book called The Patient Assassin, and it is so brilliantly written. She's a journalist for the BBC, and it is so brilliantly written, it reads like a thriller, because it starts with the hanging scene. See, this is the thing. When you write a book for the popular thing, you cannot start with, Udham Singh was born in 1922 and all that. So it starts with this very tragic hanging scene in which the hangman is measuring the length of the rope for Udham Singh. He's weighing him, measuring the length of the rope for Udham Singh. And this book was just completely unputdownable for me. And it is also very well researched because Anita Anand is actually a descendant of some of the victims of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So she went to Punjab and, she did some research. She spoke to descendants and descendants and descendants. And, it's also very well researched and yet written like a thriller. And I really wanted to write a book like that. I don't think I've entirely succeeded, but I have tried. And that is where I think popular history comes in. The book did well in the UK. In India, I don't know, somehow it didn't do well. So, yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Linkage with Subhash Chandra Bose.
Oh, yeah. I was asked this last week also. So, Bose, yes, of course, you would think that Bose would ally with these men, right? So, Chatto, I could not find any linkages to Bose, which doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's just that I could not find any linkages to Bose because Chatto died in 1937 and the INA came some years later, 41. So, I think it's possible that Bose and Chatto did not talk much, okay? Because by then, Chatto was in the Soviet Union. And in a way, Chatto had almost given up revolution. He was leading, for the first time in his life, he had some happiness with his wife, Lydia Karunskaya, and he was working in a sort of organization in the Soviet Union translating. So he was actually doing academic work. And by then, he was not so much a revolutionary, by 1937. Roy and Bose had some dealings in the sense that I found that Bose had sent a letter to Roy saying, please join my movement. By this time, Roy was back in India. And Roy refused. And he was very angry and he sent that messenger packing because Roy said, I will never ally with the Japanese because they are imperialists. And I do not believe in swapping one imperialist for another. Swapping the British for the Japanese. So Roy very clearly said that he will not do that. He believed, Roy also had visited Japan in his various movements and he was in touch with Japanese revolutionaries and with Rash Bihari Bose, who spent a lot of time in Japan. And Roy believed that the Japanese were even more savage imperialists than the British. Plus, more importantly, the Japanese were allied with the Nazis. Roy was extremely anti-Nazi. In fact, by that time, he had also been called a British spy. I mean, Roy just was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even though he had been imprisoned by the British for 6 years, they still called him a British spy because in the Second World War, Roy argued that Congress should support Britain because he said this is the only way we have to have a present a united fight against the Nazis. He was under the impression that if Hitler is, allowed to progress, he will come all the way up to India. So Roy was very anti-Nazi, and therefore he also was very anti-Subhash Chandra Bose. That was what I gathered from what he had written in his memoir.
Was Chatto secretly part of the Trotsky camp? Was that the reason for his...
I don't think Chatto ever made it as far as Trotsky. Roy was good friends with Trotsky. I think Chatto just got marginalized because Roy sort of barged in. And, there was sort of room for only one Indian at the time, and that Indian was Roy because he had distinguished himself in Mexico and, he had made many contacts. And Chatto, I don't think, made it as far as Trotsky. He came from Berlin to Moscow to meet Lenin. Lenin fobbed him off and wrote some letters, and he said, yes, I have received your thesis, I will read it. And, probably just chucked it in the bin kind of thing, So Chatto never got as far as Trotsky. He was completely pushed out by M.N. Roy. So, as far as I know anyway, yeah.
It's interesting that our pre-independence history doesn't mention these revolutionaries at all.
Yeah.
Of course, perhaps because it was, again, historical work were controlled by the British policies and imperialist ideas. But do these revolutionaries, did they have any communication with people who were operating within India, and like Bhagat Singh and others, and did they influence them?
They had contacts with India. A lot of their letters were confiscated by the British Secret Service. We forget now that Britain is a small and declining island. We forget how powerful the British Empire was then. A lot of the letters were confiscated, but they did have some contact. I don't think they had any contact with Bhagat Singh. Maybe they influenced him. They had contact with Nehru, Gandhi, the early Indian communists, and lots of other sort of revolutionaries, the Anushilan Samiti, Bhaga Jatin, all those. They had lots of contacts. And also I should mention that along with these, like the Berlin Indians that Chatto was a part of, there were many other revolutionaries there who also have been forgotten in a way, probably because they were so far away and, they were pushed out. Nehru had a very poor opinion of all these revolutionaries except for Chatto and Roy, whom he respected. So there was MPT Acharya. There has been a book written about him. There was Hardayal, who went to the US and started the Ghadar party, and nobody's, he's also been sort of more kind of forgotten. There was Champakaran Pillai. There was Madam Kama, whom we know, but in a sort of peripheral way. Madam Kama was one of the very early women talking about full independence, and she and Chatto were associates. I should also point out there was constant dissension amongst all these groups of revolutionaries. They were always fighting about things. They always had diverse opinions, and I think in a way this mirrors the story of India itself. Diversity is our strength and also our curse. And they always had different opinions, which is why they could never be united. And I was asked an interesting question last week when I did an interview, which is why somebody asked if Chatto and Roy had been given arms, and if they had been given support, and if they had, would we have got independence? If they had got support from the Germans and anything. And Vanya was saying that this is a very unhistoric question to ask. But, as for the rest of us who are not historians, people do ask that question. And I don't actually think that we would have got independence through them. They were too messy. They were too not united. They were too, leaping from ideology to ideology. I honestly think that only Gandhi could have got us independence. And when this interview came out, there was a lot of comments saying you are eulogizing Gandhi and Nehru. And I'm not eulogizing them in any way. I'm just saying that, he was the only man, Gandhi was the only man who had mass appeal, who could unite the North and the South and the East and the West. Okay? Whatever his many faults, right? And Nehru by his side. And this is exactly why Nehru did not, want to give any sort of, quarter to Chatto and Roy, because he believed in Congress unity and he thought that that is the only way to get independence. After so many years of, back and forth and, 2 steps forward and 1 step back kind of thing. So.
One quick point about Bhagat Singh, I think he's also a very different generation.
Yeah,
he's probably 20 years younger to these people.
Yes, he is.
More,
yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Yes, that's a good point. True. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. So my question is regarding. So it's actually not formed in my mind properly, but I'll go again. So you're talking about so socialism. So both of these are socialists in some way, and they are trying to influence Nehru in some way. And how is like these patterns, like, I don't know, these go on even in the present right now. So mostly it's the rich folks, rich brats, who are like somehow attracted towards socialism, and then they try to influence the poor people about their benefit, that okay, this is what you would want and this is what we think that you would want for the people. And then they're trying to just remain in the power, whatever kind of power that they had. Is it spotlight or the control, anything. So, and again, you've written about these forgotten heroes, but what about, like, what do you think about, were there any socialists who came from poorer backgrounds, who were influenced by these people? And yeah.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So Roy actually did come from a very poor background. His whole family had died by the time he was some 16 or something, and whatever he had after that was just, sort of by chance. There was no family wealth, there was no inherited wealth, and he was not educated. So, but even so, by the end of his, by the 1930s, he too was drifting away from communism because he had realized that this sort of collectivist thing just did not appeal to him anymore. And he had seen Stalin's huge misdeeds. And therefore, he moved towards the Congress, and then he eventually moved towards radical humanism. So he changed his mind, as people do. I'm trying to think of other poor people in the communist movement in India. Is that what you're asking? Amongst them, a lot of the revolutionaries, a lot of the Berlin Indians didn't necessarily come from very rich backgrounds. For instance, MPT Acharya ended up dying in real poverty. Okay, I think he died in Chennai, and he had no money at all. He died in absolute penury. I understand your point about, generally, quite often, it's the wealthy who are in favor of communism, and while secretly sending their own kids for foreign educations or I don't want to go too much into the communism versus socialism and all this because we could be here all day versus capitalism. I think many of us recognize that communism hasn't worked the way we hoped it would, and it has led to all kinds of great excesses. I do not think that even unbridled capitalism has worked the way we intended it to. Okay, that has also clearly not worked for me. Okay, in my opinion, something in the middle would be good, I think.
That, like, for a general audience, for a person who is not maybe, who does not even know what communism or socialism or these all isms are.
Sure.
Yeah. So it doesn't even matter.
Sure.
Mostly it doesn't even matter what these
True.
people say. Yeah,
You're just trying to feed yourself.
Yeah, we're living in that kind of reality. But for an intellectual like you, who understands these things, is it somehow, or maybe what you are writing, is it somehow not like, because somehow there is good to socialism, and there is some kind of, there is some like good heart over there, that okay, poor people, and we have to, there is that feeling. But when you are writing about people, when we are focusing on these charming individuals, are we not being intellectually hypocrite in some way? That okay, we are just being bedazzled by these big brats and big things, and while there are so many other historical figures, whether it is religious or like on all sorts of lines, like who just remain, and which is what I wanted to appreciate as well, that okay, you've written
I mean, I sort of take exception to, you are the intellectual kind of thing, because all of us here are in the 1%. Any person here who has a mobile phone is in the, 0.0% that is sitting on top of the rest of India. Because most of India doesn't have any of these things and is unable to come and watch YouTube or be on the internet and see that this event is published. But what you're saying is, have I glorified these men in this book? I don't believe that I have, because I've also talked about their many, many flaws. And if you read the book, you will see why. I don't feel like if we write about these people, we are necessarily glorifying them, because I think they need to be written about. And of course, there are millions of other people who also need to be written about. But, one can only do what one can do, really. I mean, that's the best way I can answer that question. So, any more questions?
Can I just come in on that very briefly?
Yes.
For that, you may have to actually go to academic history, where there was a whole kind of school called the Subaltern Studies School, which studies
Yes, of course.
peasant movements, and to just say that they were swayed is also probably, we need to problematize that concept a little bit, because these groups, peasants, they also have a politics, they also have agency, and that's also their ways of kind of gleaning that from sources, and people have written about it.
Gayatri
also.
Chakrabarti Spivak. I spent most of law school not understanding a word of what she had written, but yes, you can go into that.
Shahid Amin, Gyan Pandey, a lot of people have written about these, David Hardiman, a lot of people,
Hi. So my question is, how difficult or easy was it to access the past records and documents for your research? And do you think that, in the West, that these records are more easily accessible compared to India?
Okay. So this is a completely archival book in the sense that I traced the Chattopadhyaya family. They still exist. And in fact, they have a relation, I've forgotten the exact relation. Yes, Virendranath Chattopadhyaya's son is a stepfather of Romulus Whittaker, if you've all heard about the snake man in Chennai, who started up the Madras Snake Bank. So I traced all these people, and they had only very vague memories. They were like, yes, there was an Uncle Chatto who went to Russia and we don't know anything more about him. We think he had a daughter, but we don't know anything about him. Daughter, even I couldn't trace. So if tracing a lot of stuff is very difficult, especially about Chatto, because he just sort of disappeared into the maw of the Soviet Union, which in those days was like, in such a mess. So how did I find all this material? M.N. Roy's memoir, available. You can read it online. You can just Google. It's on archive.org. Lots of stuff that M.N. Roy wrote, the various books and pamphlets. Then, letters by Chatto and letters to Chatto and letters from the Comintern and things like that. So I found a lot of these in the British Library in London. I believe the other place that you might possibly find them is in the Nehru Memorial in Delhi. But it's hard for me to get to Delhi. And I think this is a huge problem when it comes to, people say, why do not Indians write historical non-fiction or historical, accounts as well as the West, as well as, say, Dalrymple, Frankopan, Holland, all these people. The lack of libraries has a huge amount to do with it, because the only good library is possibly in Delhi, and that is not very accessible. If you're a writer from the South, I mean, how long can you afford to go and sit in Delhi? You have to pay for your hotel stay, you have to go there, your travel, and etc. And the lack of libraries and the lack of, information being easily available is a big factor. And obviously libraries in the West are so much better. So the only reason I could write this book and the previous book is because I live very close to the British Library. And both times, the first book, the pandemic struck, so the library was closed down, the lady doctors. With this book, the British Library was hacked in October 2023 for ransomware. And they were asked to pay £800,000 in ransom, which they refused. So the entire library was non-functional. It was like then you had to go there. First, it was shut down for a long time. Then when you finally went back, it opened in a sort of analog way. So you went there with writing your book on a piece of paper, and they would go like in the old days and go and look for it, not digital. You can't find anything digital because the entire computer system was struck down. In fact, if you look at the book, I have dedicated this book to libraries and librarians, because I think they are such an incredible resource. It's such a pity we don't have enough libraries and librarians in India, and it's such a pity that successive governments have found this completely unimportant and are absolutely not bothered. So yes, it was very hard to find all these sources, and I did the best I could, but I feel like there's more that could have been found, really. Yeah.
Hi, ma'am.
Okay.
Can you share about Chatto and Roy's views about pre-independence and post-independence economic thinking?
Economic thinking. So Chatto was, of course, he became a fervent communist. So he believed in, Marxist-Leninist communism, and he thought that Nehru was, and the Congress, I mean, we all think of Nehru as a socialist, but for Chatto, Nehru was not a socialist. He was like a bourgeois. He was like really leftist, Chatto, right? So for him, Nehru was catering too much to, he believed that Gandhi catered too much to the big rich businessmen, the Birlas and so forth, who were closely linked with Gandhi. And Chatto believed that Nehru was just, selling the soul of India, the peasant, the worker, to big business. He believed that till the end of his days. Roy, as we have seen, sort of flip-flopped, okay? And he had communist, sympathies, but he believed that Congress could only take India to independence. He thought first we need to be independent, then we can think about the economy. Okay, and in fact, and again, Roy felt like the Congress is leaning too much big businessmen, not putting the peasant and the worker first, which is why Roy was so encouraging of trade unions. He wrote a lot about trade unions. He even wrote a 5-year plan. And he believed that he believed in a partyless democracy, by the way, which even Gandhi believed. But I don't know how that would actually work out in practical terms, okay? And he did not really believe in Nehruvian socialism. But what happened was we got Nehruvian socialism because Gandhi, of course, was assassinated. Does that answer your question a bit? Yeah? Parallels, I think I have gone into quite in detail. Yeah, I have gone into the details between the parallels between Roy and Chatto. They sort of flip-flopped. Yeah.
You're a very entertaining storyteller. It's been a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you.
For the benefit of the other writers and myself in this room, could you tell us a little bit about your writing process and your writing routine, please?
So there are a lot of writers in this room, I think, my friends who have turned up. Thank you all for coming such a long way on a weekday when RCB is playing. Okay, so what was I going to say? The writing process, something that I can perhaps share, I think it's okay to share, is that when I turned in this proposal, how it works is you turn in a very detailed proposal to your agent. The agent then sends it to the publisher. That proposal itself was 10,000 words. And I spent nearly a year, maybe 8-9 months, just fleshing out that proposal and thinking about the structure of this book. The structure of this book I spent a lot of time thinking about because I wanted it to flow very quickly. And the way I thought of that was one chapter Roy, one chapter Chatto, parallel lines which never meet, kind of thing. So I worked a lot on that. And then the first thing I got back from my agent was, publisher loves it, but somebody else is writing a book on the same subject. So then I felt miserable because I was like, oh my God, somebody else is already starting writing a book. He's going to write it first. And what will I do? And I've spent, 9 months or 10 months of my life on this and et cetera, et cetera. And actually before this, I wanted to write a book on the Ghadar movement, which is a very interesting movement in the Pacific Northwest of America. But somebody had already written a book about that also, a good book. So I felt like I don't know what to do. Then I went back and said, what if I write it in this way? Both Chatto and Roy in one book, not a scholarly book, an exciting book. I will do this, I will do that, I will make it exciting. And they said, okay, we will publish it. So then I had to write the book in faster than the other book could come out. So I wrote the book in 15 months, which is quite difficult. And then another 6 months for editing. So it was a real rush job. And I mean, I don't know what to tell you. I just got up every day at 5 a.m. and plowed through it. I did all the work in the library because I would be distracted at home. So I went to the library every single day and just kept sort of finishing it. And I had a deadline. And obviously, if you have a deadline, then you write faster. And I didn't meet my deadline, by the way. Deadline was March, and I turned it in 3 months later, June. Still better than most. I just kept doing it because I had said that I would do it, and the other guy is on my heels. And it'll be a different kind of book, I guess. His book will be a different kind of book for a different kind of audience. So, I mean, you just write it. There is really, I don't think there's any great mystery to writing. You just have to do it and spend less time talking about it and actually doing it, and stay off social media, and just do it. There's no other way.
And embrace the fact that at least half of the process is going to feel very torturous, along with the exhilaration that comes when you have that,
Yeah.
There's both.
Yeah, I must acknowledge my agent Jayapriya Vasudevan, who is in the audience today, and also my editor Ajita, who I think has just stepped out. So yeah, you need a great agent, you need a great editor, because quite often during the process you're like, I can't do this, I won't do this, I'm leaving. And so that is where your agent comes in, which most agents don't do, but she does. So she kept saying, no, you must do it, you can do it, you will do it. And Ajita also had read a sample chapter, which was a chapter on Agnes Smedley. And she said, this is brilliant and I want to see more of this from you, which really helps, because when you're writing the book, you're like in a complete mess. You don't know, is it this good, is this bad? Nothing. You don't know. You're just keeping on going. And there are definitely parts of the book that are weaker than others. I think this happens with every book. But Ajita also kind of said, keep going, keep going, keep going. So I did that. So thank you so much to everybody who's come. Thank you also to the BIC, and thank you very much, Vanya, for helping with this.
Good fun
Thanks,
reading your
everybody.
book.
Yeah.